The police allegedly lobbed tear gas canisters across the border and fired live ammunition.
You know, something's shifting in Africa, and it's not subtle. Tanzania, once known for its calm politics and steady leadership, suddenly feels poised at the edge of a new era. What began as a routine election in October 2025 has spiraled into one of the most intense youth-led uprisings the country has ever seen. Streets filled with chants, airports went silent, and the government, well, it's struggling to convince people that everything's fine. But you can't call something fine when the people have stopped believing it. What's happening in Tanzania isn't just political unrest, it's a generational reckoning. The youth aren't waiting for permission to speak anymore. They're demanding to be heard. And whether you see it as chaos or change probably depends on what you fear more: a loud Africa or an awake one. Let's talk about it in detail. You know, sometimes history doesn't knock before it walks in. It just shows up, uninvited, inconvenient, and impossible to ignore. That's exactly what happened in Tanzania this October. On the surface, it looked like every other election. Posters fluttering on dusty streets, candidates waving, the national flag hanging proudly behind wooden podiums. Everything seemed calm. Too calm, actually. But here's the thing: calm can lie. It can sit like a sheet over something boiling underneath. And in Dar es Salaam, you could feel that heat rising, quietly, in conversations, in cafes, in those small pauses before people spoke about politics. You know, that kind of silence that isn't peace? That was it. People weren't content. They were careful. The signs were there, even before the first ballot box opened. Opposition candidates were disqualified or sidelined. Some journalists just disappeared from the headlines. Internet speeds mysteriously dropped whenever something controversial trended. Yet everyone pretended not to notice because, well, Tanzanians are used to being told that peace is the priority. And yeah, peace is good, but peace that demands silence isn't peace at all. It's pressure, and that pressure has a limit. It always does. When the election results came out, the same ruling party, the same speeches about unity and progress, something broke. Not loudly at first, more like a deep breath before a scream. The youth especially felt it. Generation Z, the kids who grew up online, who've watched the world change in real time, suddenly realized that change at home was still being rationed. You could almost feel the collective snap across the country, that moment when hope stops whispering and starts shouting. These weren't rebels. They weren't even particularly political in the old-fashioned sense. They were just tired. Tired of patience being used as control. Tired of elections that looked like choices but weren't. Tired of leaders speaking of future generations while ignoring the present one. And here's the part people outside Africa often miss. This isn't just about Tanzania. It's about a continent that's young, restless, connected, and done waiting. Africa's median age is 19, you know? 19. That means half the continent is younger than the politicians running it. And these young people, they think differently. They don't worship authority, they question it. They don't dream of leaving anymore. They dream of fixing. So yeah, when they saw another election that felt like deja vu, they didn't just shrug. They marched, they tweeted, they filmed, they occupied. The message was simple but loud: we've waited long enough. And once that message left their mouths, it spread, fast, uncontrollable, electric. It stopped being an election story and became something bigger. A generational line in the sand. Tanzania wasn't just voting anymore, it was waking up. And that awakening, that mix of anger and clarity, didn't come out of nowhere. It was built layer by layer, by years of disappointment dressed up as progress. To really see where this wave came from, we have to look at what caused it. That election itself, the one that pretended to be democracy but felt like deja vu. You know, elections are supposed to be like mirrors. They should show a country its own reflection. But in Tanzania's case, the mirror was fogged, deliberately. It was one of those moments where everything looked democratic on paper. But if you tilted the paper just right, you could see the watermark of control shining underneath. President Samia Suluhu Hassan stood there, calm, polite, articulate, promising stability, promising reform. And to the outside world, it looked perfect. Western diplomats nodded approvingly, you know? The international press called her a voice of calm in a turbulent region. Investors smiled, markets relaxed. Everyone loves a story that sounds like peace. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes peace is just censorship wearing a suit. Behind the smiles, the real contest had already been decided. Opposition leaders were disqualified or detained for procedural issues. Others just vanished from the conversation altogether. The media was soft-spoken, as if afraid to say the wrong word. And when a government starts deciding who gets to compete, is it still an election or is it theater? That's the thing that struck so many young Tanzanians. It wasn't even about who won. It was about the feeling that winning wasn't possible anymore. Everything was framed to look participatory, but participation without influence is just decoration. It's a democracy with the batteries taken out. And the way the world reacted, that might be the part that stung the most. The same Western nations that hold seminars about democracy, that fund workshops about civic freedom, didn't say a word. They applauded Tanzania's peaceful elections. Peaceful, huh? Peaceful for whom? Peaceful for the powerful, maybe. That's what people forget. Silence can be violent too. When injustice is ignored, it doesn't disappear. It mutates. It becomes frustration, then protest, then revolution. It's like pressure building in a closed room. And in Tanzania, that room was airtight. For Gen Z, this wasn't just another political disappointment. It was personal. They've grown up being told to trust the system, to respect authority. But they've also seen what happens when they do nothing. No change, no accountability, just a different name on the same policy. So when the 2025 election came and looked suspiciously like every election before it, something inside them said, enough. You could see it online even before the protests started. Tweets turned to threads, threads turned to videos, videos turned to action. It's funny, right? How quickly disillusionment becomes organization when people realize they're not alone in it. And when that realization spread, when young people from Dodoma to Mwanza started realizing they were all feeling the same betrayal, that's when the election stopped being a political event and became a social awakening. That's what happens when people realize they've been acting in someone else's play. They stop following the script. And once you stop following the script, you can't go back to pretending it's real. That's why, when the votes were counted and the same result flashed on every TV screen, people didn't stay home this time. They stepped out. They filled the streets. They said, "We voted, but now we'll be heard." And that's where everything shifted. The protests weren't just a reaction, they were a realization, an awakening that no law, no slogan, no smile from the president could contain anymore. Because when people finally understand that democracy has become performance, they stop being the audience, and they become the actors. You know, when people say the youth are the future, they usually mean it in that soft, polite, distant way, like a line they say at speeches. But what they forget is that the future eventually grows up, and when it does, it knocks on your door. That's what happened in Tanzania. The youth stopped waiting for the future. They brought it. It started small. A few students, a few voices online, one video here, one thread there, nothing dramatic at first, just frustration, honest and raw, but you could feel it building. There was something different in their tone this time. It wasn't just a complaint, it was clarity. They weren't asking for permission anymore. They were stating reality. Then, like a heartbeat speeding up, it spread. Universities, neighborhoods, marketplaces, everywhere, that same pulse. Young people weren't waiting for politicians to lead them. They were leading themselves. They organized through group chats and they coordinated through hashtags. No meetings, no official leaders, just trust and timing. It was beautiful, really. Almost poetic. Like a generation finally speaking the language that only it could understand. And you could see how scared the government got, not because it didn't expect protests, but because it didn't know who to blame. There was no single person to arrest, no party to accuse of incitement. This wasn't about ideology, it was about identity. The system could handle opposition, but it couldn't handle awakening. The slogans were simple but powerful. "We want truth," shouted by kids who had grown up hearing only half of it. For them, this was personal. They'd seen the country's beauty, the beaches, the mountains, the rich history, and they couldn't understand why its politics still looked like a bad rerun. Why promise the world and deliver silence? Why talk about progress while punishing anyone who defines it differently? You could feel the rhythm of the protests. It wasn't just anger, it was purpose. These young people weren't breaking things for the sake of it. They were breaking patterns, and honestly, it was inspiring. Even the way they used humor, turning fear into memes, turning propaganda into parody, showed they weren't afraid anymore. That's the thing about laughter. It's rebellion disguised as joy. But no matter how peaceful a protest starts, those in power often mistake passion for danger. The government started labeling them agitators, foreign influenced, all those usual terms. It's easier to dismiss a movement if you make it sound like a threat. But this wasn't foreign. It was local. It was homegrown, deeply Tanzanian. It was young people saying, "We love this country enough to argue with it." That's a kind of patriotism the old generation doesn't always understand. The kind that's loud, messy, and absolutely sincere. They weren't protesting against Tanzania. They were protesting for it. They wanted it to become what it always said it was. And you could sense something bigger taking shape. It wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a mirror. A reflection of an entire generation saying, "We're here now. We see what's wrong, and we're not leaving quietly." That's when you knew. This wasn't just another day of unrest. This was a shift, a spiritual one, a generational one, a point of no return. And once that kind of energy hits the streets, power always reacts the same way. It panics. Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. It's strange, governments always say they're protecting peace, but when they start bringing out soldiers, you can't help but wonder who the peace is really for. Like, who exactly are they protecting? Because it sure isn't the people shouting for their voices to be heard. When the curfews came, it didn't even feel real at first. Streets that had been full of music and chanting suddenly went quiet, almost eerily so. You could hear the hum of military trucks before you even saw their lights, and then crack. That sound. Tear gas, rubber bullets, sometimes not even rubber. It's one thing to talk about unrest on the news, but another thing entirely when the air burns your lungs. They called it necessary action, maintaining order. Those are the words officials always use when they're losing control. But you can't restore order with fear. All you do is remind people why they rose in the first place. And it's heartbreaking, really, seeing your own soldiers point guns at their own people. The same people they're supposed to protect. It's like watching a country forget its reflection. You could see the disbelief on people's faces. Not anger yet, just disbelief. Like they were trying to process how quickly our government had turned into the government. But that disbelief didn't last long. Fear arrived, fast and heavy. Social media is filled with warnings. Stay indoors. They're shooting near the stadium. Avoid the bridge. And still, people came out. Because, once fear becomes familiar, it loses its grip. Once you've already risked everything to be heard, what else is left to lose? The state thought it could scare people into silence, but the opposite happened. Every gunshot just made the movement stronger. It's like people collectively decided, if they're willing to shoot at us for speaking, then speaking must matter more than ever. You could see mothers standing beside their sons, elders holding hands with young activists. It wasn't just a youth movement anymore. It had become a national conscience. People weren't just protesting policies. They were protesting how easily humanity had been traded for security. And, it's weird, but there's something sacred in that kind of courage. That moment when people stop asking for freedom and just live it, even if it costs them everything. Videos started leaking online despite the blackout. Faces covered in dust, eyes red from gas, voices hoarse but defiant. You could hear them shouting, "Hatutoki, we're not leaving." And, that line, it hit differently. Because they didn't just mean the protest site, they meant the fight. They meant their place in history. The government thought it could end the uprising with violence, but violence doesn't end defiance. it plants it deeper. Fear spreads fast, sure, but so does faith. And faith, once it catches fire, is impossible to contain. And that's when the protest changed again. It stopped being about just the streets. It started targeting symbols, the biggest, loudest ones. Places that represented pride and power. And when that happened, even the sky wasn't safe. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. You know, it's funny, airports are supposed to be places of movement, of escape, right? You arrive, you depart, you move on. But, when everything exploded in Tanzania, the airport became the opposite of that. It turned into a cage for everyone. Julius Nyerere International Airport, the pride of Dar es Salaam, the gateway to the world, suddenly became a battlefield. Flights grounded, cars burning, people shouting. The irony was brutal. The place named after the man who dreamed of freedom and unity was now the site of division and chaos. This means you couldn't write symbolism more painful than that. And here's the part that really stuck with people. The rich couldn't fly away this time. The politicians, the businessmen, the foreign diplomats who always had an exit route, they were trapped too. For once, everyone was in the same storm. Protesters had flipped the script. It wasn't just about shouting in the streets anymore. It was about hitting the heart of mobility, of privilege. They were saying, if we can't move forward, no one will. The air filled with smoke, with sirens, with that strange silence that only comes after an explosion. The footage that got out, even under blackout, was surreal. Young men and women blocking runways, waving flags, shouting, "Hockey! Hockey! Justice!" You could see it in their eyes. They knew this wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a transformation, messy and loud and irreversible. Then came the blackout, the predictable move. Pull the plug, shut down the internet, and hope the story dies. But that never really works anymore, does it? Not in Africa, not in 2025, because what governments forget is the youth are the internet now. You cut off one connection, and 10 more pop up through VPNs, satellite links, foreign reporters, friends in Nairobi or Lagos or Johannesburg. You can't silence an entire generation that was born online. Within hours, Tanzanian voices started echoing across the continent. Hashtags began trending. Kenyan influencers spoke up. Nigerian journalists covered it. Ghanaian activists live-streamed their solidarity. It was as if Africa itself said, "We hear you." And that right there was a turning point. Because this wasn't just Tanzania anymore. It was Africa seeing itself, hearing itself, defending itself. For so long, Africans were told their struggles were local, isolated. But suddenly, the youth realized their pain rhymed. Different languages, same rhythm. The government wanted silence, but what it got instead was an echo, one so loud it bounced across borders. It reminded everyone that the era of isolation was over. You can block Wi-Fi, sure, but you can't block awareness. And it's kind of poetic, The same tools they used to control airports, networks, and systems became the same ones that turned against them. But while Africa leaned in and listened, the rest of the world, it mostly looked away. Or worse, looked down. That's when the story stopped being just about the protests and became a mirror reflecting how the world still treats African pain. There's this strange thing that always happens whenever Africa erupts. The world looks up, frowns a little, mumbles something about stability, and then just moves on. It's like clockwork. And Tanzania's crisis wasn't any different. Within hours of the protests filling the streets, the same old statements started rolling out. We are deeply concerned. We urge calm on all sides. We call for dialogue. You could almost hear the copy-paste fatigue in every line. It's like they've got a template saved somewhere. Just change the country name and done. But here's what makes it sting. It's not that the world said too little, it's that it said the wrong things. When people are bleeding, you don't ask them to calm down. You don't tell them to be patient. You ask who hurt them. You hold the one with the weapon accountable. But no, the global community played its favorite role again, the neutral observer. And neutrality, when you have power, isn't neutral at all. It's a choice. it's a side. You had Western nations, the usual ones, issuing travel advisories. Avoid non-essential travel to Tanzania. Exercise caution. The same governments that invest billions into African development were suddenly more concerned about tourists than Tanzanian citizens. The same voices that lecture Africa about democracy couldn't even whisper the word repression when it actually mattered. It's kind of ironic, when Africa votes, the West sends observers. When Africa rises, it sends warnings. Maybe because an Africa that obeys is useful, but an Africa that questions is dangerous. And human rights organizations, sure, they spoke too. Reports, condemnations, and petitions. Important, yes, but it always feels like paperwork after the fact, doesn't it? Like the world documents African pain better than it helps it. We get paragraphs instead of protection. Still, something changed this time. The silence didn't discourage people, it exposed something. Africans started realizing again that they are their own safety net. Waiting for outside validation is just another form of dependence. That freedom to mean anything has to be self-defined, self-defended. And maybe that's what frightens the powerful the most, a continent that no longer needs applause to believe it's right. A continent that can say, we see what's happening and we'll handle it ourselves. I guess, in a way, the world's silence was a gift, a painful one, but a gift still. Because, it forced Africa to look inward, not outward, to stop waiting for heroes and start becoming them. You could feel that realization spreading, quietly but steadily across the continent, like a light turning on one window at a time. Because if there's one thing history keeps proving, it's that Africa doesn't collapse under pressure. It evolves through it. And Tanzania right now is that evolution in real time. What happens next will decide if this moment becomes a tragedy or a turning point. So now, if your voice was silenced, would you still whisper or would you scream? Let us know in the comments section. If your country kept breaking your heart, would you leave it or fight to fix it? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.